Well, thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. I'll start with just quick intros, I think, starting with Dave here at the end. Can you just give everybody a sense of your role and what you oversee day to day at Instagram?
Yeah, for sure. So if I describe the mission of Instagram Sports as being bringing people closer to the things and people they love about sports, the athletes, the fandom, the moments, my responsibility is to advocate on behalf of that sports ecosystem and our partners like Turner Sports. And so I feel like I do that in three ways. One is I participate on panels and shout from the rafters the fact that Instagram has 320 million sports fans, content ranging from the most premium highlights to athlete-driven content. The second is I strategize with our partners across our ecosystem, athletes, teams, leagues, media partners, around how they can best use Instagram to achieve their business goals. And then third, and probably the most important yet challenging part of my role at Instagram, is how do I advocate on behalf of our partners the things that are unique to sports that Instagram needs to think about and build to build this as a great platform for our sports partners. So working with comms, working with engineering, working with product to make sure the interests of sports are represented within our walls.
Awesome. Morgan?
Yeah. Hi, my name's Morgan Dewan, and I'm the VP of Social Media for Turner Sports and Turner Studios. As far as Turner Sports, what my job entails is making sure that social media is used in really two different ways. One, making sure that it is a platform that can be used to engage the traditional sports fans around our traditional properties like NBA TV, NBA on TNT, PGA Championship, MLB postseason, and making sure that the TV viewer it has a second screen experience to engage. The other part of that is making sure that we're kind of the tip of the spear for the younger generation. So making sure that with Gen Z and the millennial audiences, maybe they don't have a traditional cable package at home. We still want them to have affinity for our brands. And so we want to be that first entry point. And then with Turner Studios, we work as a consultancy of sorts across the kind of whole Warner Media portfolio, making sure that all of our brands kind of have case studies and best practices to use in the space.
Cool, and add a little bit of credibility on this side of the table. So CEO and owner of STN, we work primarily in sports and entertainment. We're a social first marketing company. We work with Turner, we work quite a bit in the entertainment space also with award shows, NBC Sports and the Olympics. So I think one of the main reasons we're up here is from a ProMax standpoint, they really wanted to dig into sports and social, and I think no other industry really is doing it better, I think, than sports from an innovative standpoint, just from being unique and finding ways to connect with, especially, millennials and Gen Z. So I wanted to get a little bit to start on the Instagram side, just 1 billion users, just a couple. And you may not be able to say it, but I think Morgan and I will say it, like it's a platform that is really right now the best in the game in terms of organic engagement and reaching that fan base. So can you speak to just, you started at YouTube, you went to Whistle, then you went to Complex, you've been on both sides of it, and now being at Instagram, kind of the coolest things you've seen the platform do for folks?
Yeah, I think Instagram has become a place where people want to engage in, as I mentioned, interest in people, and that's so much predicated on authenticity. And I feel like Instagram's really figured out how to build a platform where users can engage in that kind of content and go deep into their passions, but also our partners are able to use that platform to speak very authentically back to their partners. And so if there's one thing that's, I don't want to say surprising about Instagram, but if I rewind my career 6+ years when I was within the walls of YouTube to today being at Instagram, it is how much Instagram is thinking about the next generation of sports fans, of users that are coming onto these platforms. We are so keenly focused on a teen and youth demographic, and how can we stay relevant to young people, and subsequently, how are our partners thinking about engaging their next generation of sports fans who we know are gonna live on that platform.
And I think, 5 years ago, social media, Morgan and I talk about this all the time, really didn't get a seat at the table. Now they have a seat at every table, it seems like. From your experience at Turner Sports, how have you seen that evolution since you started and since you and I met back in 2013, 2014?
Yeah, it was interesting. So a couple of years ago, I guess in 2015, I started talking to all the social media teams within than kind of the Time Warner portfolio. And one thing that we found was that when you talk to the social media leads and you ask them what their KPIs were and what they were measuring against, it was oftentimes mapped to whatever department they were sitting in. So I think as we look at the last 5 years, part of that evolution is actually, it's closely related to whatever department that team sits in. So a lot of social media teams started in marketing, right? So that it became a content marketing engine, some product marketing, but it really became about day, date, and time, tune in, get people to the TV. That's great. The next evolution of that was, okay, well, maybe it's not just a marketing function. Maybe it's audience development. Maybe it's these other things. So then people started putting social in more of a digital category. Okay, that's good. And we start expanding at that point. And then I think kind of the current frontier of it is, and the reason social has a seat at the table is that it's just good content, right? And content can go everywhere. And social media content doesn't necessarily need to be snackable. It doesn't necessarily need to be short. It can be long form and perform extremely well there. So I don't think it's the final frontier, but I think getting social more ingrained with just great content creators is kind of the next iteration of that.
Yeah, and just to expound upon that, I think the partners we work with best are ones who have aligned content as that overall pillar and haven't segmented to the point that Morgan made around it's marketing or it's social. They're all one and the same in many regards. And there's an example we like to talk about internally about one of the most successful, if not the most successful NFL franchise regarding audience engagement and content. And I bet if I ventured to ask the audience who that franchise would be, your first guesses might be the Dallas Cowboys, maybe the New York Giants, a big market team. The best franchise on social, on Instagram, from a content perspective and audience perspective, is the Miami Dolphins. The Miami Dolphins generate 5 times more revenue in branded content than any other franchise in the NFL. And the major reason behind that is because they have organized their department around content, and they haven't segmented those functions to the point where those teams are not talking to each other.
And from a television network perspective, we've talked a lot about linear productions, social productions, how those are starting to merge, because those really used to be 2 different silos that, social used to be kind of the ugly stepchild too, like, hey, can we get 5 minutes with Chuck or Shaq? And now you're starting to see, it seems like, that those 2 things, I mean, if they're not already married, they have to in order to succeed in the future.
Yeah, I think it can apply to all aspects of life, but I think if you can reach across the aisle, right? Like if you can find TV people who are genuinely interested in how social works and how social functions, and same with social. Social has a ton to learn from TV. You can actually start moving that forward. But yeah, I mean, we had kind of an aha moment the other day. We've always had our social media live productions have always been separate of TV. And maybe that started in the beginning because TV didn't have time to kind of deal with social. But I think as a lot of people have come around of like, oh, we understand that this is where a lot of the audience is and there's some cool experimentation that can happen here. We saw an example that somebody did with the World Cup, and they actually used the same studio set, some of the same talent, but all of the same above the line and below the line producers and production staff on the social execution as they did TV. And I don't know why that was like such an aha moment, but it was like, oh, wow, we can save a lot of money. We can have access to some of the best talent. Some of those TV folks could be, are able to learn the social way of doing things, and it just is a lot more efficient. So I think that's where we're headed, is that it doesn't have to be 2 disparate productions anymore. Let's come together and find ways of making it work.
Just curious, given you work with some of the most premium sports talent.
Hey, Dave, I'm the moderator.
In the world, yeah, sorry. Well, I don't get to see her very much.
No, it's all
I
good.
got to take advantage. How often are you seeing the talent you work with engage your production and social teams around how they can get better at social and subsequently extend what you're producing, whether it's on linear or on social?
Some of it's generational. I think like some of the like the older former athletes that we work with are a little gun shy, and they want to be more buttoned up on social media. And
Charles Barkley on Twitter is my dream.
Yeah, never gonna happen. Yeah, you can.
Please.
So some of those older athletes they want to be more buttoned up. They want to have more of their television presence. But I think, trying to coach them in is like, hey, people are interested in your day-to-day life too, right? Like about that authenticity. They don't care just about what you're doing behind a desk. But what's so cool and what we're so excited about is kind of as the next generation retires, they understand it. They've been growing up with it. And it's just going to be kind of endemic to what they do, and they don't need to be coached up as much. So, we're willing to work with a former athlete or an athlete however much they want to, and we know that some people are not willing to share their whole lives, and that's okay.
I think one mistake that we see working with a bunch of different brands across the space is, a marketer will throw a 16:9 30-second commercial on Instagram or on social and wonder why it's not getting engagement, wonder why it's not working. I'm sure both of you have thoughts on this, but being genuine to social, being authentic, and being a piece of content needs to be social inherently to really work and be genuine, but I'm sure both of you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think anytime we get a piece of content, someone's like, can you push this out socially? Like we die a little bit inside, just in the way, you told me a great story earlier about one of my counterparts at ESPN who, she was like, hey, I would never go into the truck and tell you what to put in an A block. Like, don't tell me how to program Instagram stories. So there is a little bit of that, but I think we tend to be really collaborative at Turner Sports, which is my favorite part of working there. And so I think what we found is like a really good rhythm with a lot of our guys that are working in more traditional forums, and they don't just hand us something that's been done and say, push this out on social. They're saying, hey, I'm about to go into the edit bay, I'm gonna cut this, this, and this. How and why, or how can I cut something for you that's actually going to resonate on social? And then at that point, it becomes a dialogue of, hey, we really want to open up with a tighter shot because that's what's going to, has thumb stopping power in the news feed. And when it becomes that dialogue instead of just prepackaged assets, like now you've got some real collaboration.
Yeah, and I think to Morgan's point, you have to play to the strengths of each platform. Instagram prides itself on being a great platform for interactivity with fans. And so there isn't necessarily really a one-size-fits-all for a piece of content that can live in 3 or 4 or 5 different places. I think a lot about our peer platforms, whether it's YouTube or Snapchat, et cetera, the audiences for the same partners can look a lot different in those platforms. So while I'm sure Snapchat would love to receive archival content that they can recut and repackage for their platform, Snapchat's 70% female? And so how do our partners think about that platform, their audience, test different types of content that may resonate with an audience that doesn't look the same that it may look on Instagram on their channels or on YouTube, et cetera. And so I think for us, we're constantly encouraging our partners to understand that while it may fly in the face a bit in terms of the economics of producing content and distributing that content, the sophistication with which you can apply those platform principles can make all the difference in terms of will an audience want to engage your brand in that moment and then moving forward.
And you'll notice on Snapchat, right, like the content's moving every second because it's a younger demographic. There has to be a cut, there has to be a motion graphic, there has to be something to kind of break up, to keep that attention with the younger demo, and every platform is different. I want to talk a little bit about House of Highlights and Bleacher Report, and I'll say it because you guys probably can't say it, but I think it really killed, if not severely disrupted, the SportsCenter model on ESPN, and it kind of started with Vine there for a second, but highlights are now uploaded instantaneously on these platforms, especially in the NBA. I know that's a sister partner, obviously, with Bleacher and House of Highlights, but what have they done so well, and why have they been so disruptive on Instagram specifically?
I think what was brilliant about House of Highlights on Instagram was that it was born out of a need. So Omar just wanted to look at old LeBron highlights, and there was no place doing that, so he did it himself. And I think as content creators and working for these big media companies, we always are like, okay, it has to be original, fresh, new, innovative, and there's certainly a time and a place for that, but sometimes it's just born out of consumer need. And so he didn't create anything new. He just found old things, repurposed them, and put a personality on it. So I think that's kind of the brilliance of House of Highlights, and obviously it's become, a big franchise.
And sports highlights inherently have always been an aggregation of content. You tune in the TV at 10:30 or 11 p.m. at night at your local television station, and we're going to show you what happened that day. And on the Instagram, although it's a totally separate platform, he just used that same model that works so well. in television.
I mean, look how many partners have fallen in suit with what Omar essentially said as far as a trend. And what I find so fascinating about House of Highlights, and we've talked about them a lot, you and I personally, David, you know, at its essence, what he was posting on our platform or on other platforms was highly undifferentiated. He was posting repurposed highlights content, things that he didn't own, but the thing that he nailed far and above beyond anybody else was he had a tone, he had a voice, and he spoke authentically to young people, and they engaged him in ways that many of his peers who were posting very similar pieces of content were not able to do. And look what has happened with that business. It's a business that now distributes premium original content on YouTube. They have deals with Twitter. They continue to engage their audience on Instagram. And so for me, it is a great example. And to an extent, Barstool, I would also argue, is an interesting, albeit more controversial example of how much voice matters when it comes to engaging an audience, irrespective of platform. But for Omar, I think he picked the right platform with Instagram in terms of how he built his audience.
From a Instagram standpoint, what are some mistakes that you see other brands making?
I would hesitate to call them mistakes. I think we touched on one around the one-size-fits-all piece, which, again, having worked for media companies the past number of years and understanding some of the economics behind it and why it may make sense to go wide with distribution, I think you have to be very mindful of what the audience wants to see on a platform-by-platform basis. The other thing that I think about a lot with regard to how brands can continue to, if not stay ahead of the curve, at least be on that curve, and that is really trying to lean into where are young people consuming content. I think when all of us were growing up, and as we think about the term generation, we think of it in terms of my generation and my parents' generation.
Right.
I think the way we all should be thinking about generations is, what's the difference between a 7th grader and a 10th grader? Where do they consume content? What are their preferences in terms of communicating with each other? And how do you meet them at those places, whether it was Snapchat a couple of years ago, Instagram, Discord, Twitch, et cetera, et cetera. I think paying attention to those trends and leaning into some of those trends and figuring out how to resource against them is really critical, because these generations are being compressed. It's not so much my older brother and his 5-year-old kid. It is literally the difference between my brother and an older brother who's 4 years older, and what are our preferences and how is that different?
I think one thing I'm leery of is anybody who says they're all in on a specific platform. Like, I think, no offense. I mean, we're all in on Instagram. Don't get me wrong.
Until Zuckerberg changes the algorithm.
Yeah. But like putting your eggs in one basket is not a good strategy for any element of business, let alone social media. So I think the last time we looked at what my team programs every day, it's over 17 different products. So between Facebook newsfeed, Facebook stories, live, Twitter moments, Twitter live, I mean, it goes on and on. So it's 17 different platforms. So, you know, I think in the world that we live in, when something's hot one minute and not the next, figuring out how to resource against that is incredibly important, but making sure that you're hiring people not because they're a YouTube expert or because they're a Snapchat expert. Hire them because they're good content creators, or they ask the right questions, they're really curious, they have a work ethic, they understand, and then they can go from platform to platform. I've seen a lot of my counterparts who used to design their social media teams on, okay, this team's gonna take care of Facebook, this one's gonna take care of Twitter. That's just limiting somebody in their career, number one. And number two, when, you know, Facebook flips a switch and all of a sudden we're not getting near the ROI on this type of content as we did on something else, you don't want to be beholden to that, and you don't want to have your people beholden to that either.
I think one thing we've all heard is quality over quantity. I know your colleague, Emma May, Senior Vice President at Bleacher Report and Turner Sports as well on the marketing side, she said something interesting to me, which I thought was cool. Like, you know, they don't have to follow you. Yeah. Which is interesting why you safeguard, like, we don't want to put that on Instagram, or we want to wait a couple hours for that, or we want to make it vertical content rather than a 16:9. How have you kind of, I guess, social touches everything from marketing to the board of directors to the talent. How have you kind of not fought those battles, but tried to educate people on how important programming those different channels are?
Yeah, I don't think you can, not all content is created equally. So there, especially like NBA on Twitter is a phenomenon. And so when big moments happen, you have to be first on some of it, right? So whether it's a highlight or it's hitching on to a meme that's happening on NBA Twitter, like you have to be there first to be a part of the conversation. But being a bit more thoughtful about how you program those channels with some of the different content that you have is really important. So, I think in the early years of social media, and I've been working in social since 2010, we were always trying to crack the algorithm, right? So we would call the platforms and say like, okay, what is it today? How do we get prioritized? What do we need? And that was exhausting. And a lot of our partners, like they didn't even know. It was a product decision that, was made. So I think there's been a sense of maturity that's come along in this space in the last couple of years, and just really saying, okay, good content will always rise to the top. So with the exception of that really quick turn and meme type highlight content that has to happen in the moment, really being thoughtful and programmatic about how we roll things out is definitely taken a lot of the anxiety.
And a good example of that, I think, is Nike's 3-minute World Cup ad that was plastered everywhere on every platform. That just works. It's like really good content. And it didn't really need to change based on platform, but that's like is that a decision that you think marketers have to make, content by content, strategy by strategy? Like, what do you tell your partners when using the platform?
Yeah, I think part of it is marrying what their business objectives are, right? And how do you do that in a tasteful way? I look at how ESPN has evolved in terms of, and we sort of touched on it with content as an overall pillar versus segmenting functions. It's one thing if ESPN in their story or feed is going to throw, for all intents and purposes, a glorified ad telling their audience to tune into the Raptors and the Warriors, game 3 at 6 o'clock or whenever that game is. It's another thing if they're using Instagram Live to go live during pregame with exclusive content that you're not going to get on a broadcast. That's also creating a sense of urgency for fans who are being notified that ESPN is going live.
In a more organic way or genuine way. Right?
Absolutely, an organic, genuine way. May have some of their talent involved, but how do you do that in, again, a tasteful way that does drive an underlying business objective, like tune in for ESPN as a good example. And I think we see good actors in that space, and then we see, lesser actors in that space who still think of it in terms of a box of, okay, well, if my objective is I need to drive a transaction with my consumer, this is the ad for that transaction, versus how do I do that in a really tasteful way that's going to meet the consumer and actually engage them in content they like that may also elicit a specific action they want them to take.
Let's talk IGTV because you can't say it, but I think Morgan and I can agree that algorithm's being juiced a little bit right now, and that content seemed to work. And I think the big thing, at first, is it wanted to compete with YouTube kind of as a standalone platform, but inherently, it really was just an amazing feature on top of Instagram. And once you guys made that change, I think everybody in social marketing kind of appreciated that, because now the view more after 1 minute is really an amazing thing that's happening right now. How have you at Turner Sports leveraged IGTV or long form?
Yeah, we did an interesting experiment, which I'll touch on in a minute, but I think I have a saying that at Turner Sports, we just don't do social for social's sake, right? Like, you have to, there's a degree of experimentation that has to happen, but if you're not running your social media team like a business, then you're doing everybody a disservice. So whether it's we do a lot of content ROI mapping, right? So we actually look at how many resources, how many hours, people, and money we're spending against every platform that we publish to. And we map that directly back to how many views is it getting, what's the engagement rate, and how are we monetizing it. And to kind of bring it full circle to what you were talking about is like getting a seat at the table. We only got a seat at the table because we started bringing in cold hard cash, right? So that was part of it. Like, it wasn't just a nice to have, right? So treating it like a business in that way. So back to IGTV, we have an interesting process on our team that runs every 90 days, and it was called IDC, Insight Driven Content. We're changing that name because we feel like it should be insight informed and not just insight driven, because we want to allow for some creativity in it as well. But we did a test because Instagram was telling us, okay, IGTV has to be shot vertically and repurposed vertically. Well, that takes a lot more resources and manpower, and so we of course trust our partners, but we wanted to see for ourselves. So
I mean, meaning if you had 20 videos a week, you have to take an editor, now make it all vertical, which takes 2 hours per video, and now you're talking about another full-time position.
Yeah, so now you're cutting something vertically, cutting it in a square, and cutting it, horizontally, which is 3 times the work. Yep. So what we do is over a course of 90 days, and it's not a perfect science, but we A/B test the amount of content that we have, and we ran some of it vertically, and we ran some of it horizontally, and we compared the results. And of course, everything vertically was 10x better. So we say, okay, well that's a good use of what we're doing, and that's when we make the strategic decision of our personnel and our resources. Okay, we're going to pull back from this product that isn't performing as well and start investing those resources into IGTV.
I almost feel like Instagram should have taken the advice I've doled out today around not thinking that one size fits all, because from a vertical perspective, not all types of content are meant to be consumed in a vertical format. And I think there are a number of proof points that we socialized externally at the launch of IGTV, which predated my joining Instagram, which was towards the end of August of last year. But there are a number of proof points about how consumers are holding their phone and how they want to engage content. And I actually think you're going to hear a lot more of that in the next few months with Quibi, and if and when they actually release all the content they've been spending money on over the past couple of years. For us, the one size fits all is us learning over the past year or so that there are certain content types that really fit well in a vertical format. And the irony is in sports, it may be less the case than other verticals. If
basketball plays on a rectangle.
Exactly. From a personal perspective, when I watch highlights, if I'm watching in vertical, I feel like I'm missing part of the play, or at least seeing how that play evolves. And so having to do a learning and also looking at data internally around, okay, this content may be less resonant because it is a certain content type and it may not play to this vertical prescription that we went to market with. Whereas if you are in fashion or beauty and you want to show your audience the nuances of putting on certain makeup or illustrating something that is a little more intimate in first person, that plays really well vertically. And so how do we actually figure out how to build a product and a surface that serves the needs of our partners and also, more importantly, serves the needs of our audience? When I spoke on David's podcast a couple of days ago, he's getting a lot of FaceTime with me and vice versa this week. We talked about Instagram playing to its superpowers, and you referenced IGTV previews and feed. And for me, the greatest superpower that Instagram has is we have such amazing partners who have already done a job of building audience. How do we take the friction out of moving that audience from surface to surface on our platform? And at
i.e. link in bio.
Exactly. And even for IGTV, it was admittedly hard for users to get to IGTV to consume mid and long form content when it launched. And this was me at Complex trying to figure out how this whole thing worked and how we could use it as distribution for mid and long form content. And we've moved to a place where we've enabled partners to really leverage that surface, whether it's for additional distribution, whether it's for content that's specific to the Instagram platform. And hopefully we'll continue to make those evolutions with not just IGTV, but all the products that we're building that are meant to serve many of the people in this room, whether it's IGTV, whether it's shopping, whether it's continuing to improve the user experience and feed, et cetera, et cetera.
I want to sneak a couple more in here because I know we're short on time, but Morgan, I have one for you. The elephant in the room is linear advertising is still a $70, $80 billion beast that is the main way Turner Sports makes their money with linear television commercials. How do you balance the future? Because obviously in the next 10 years, we'll start to see that continue to decline. But then the future is digital and OTT and being able to monetize on those platforms. So how do you do that with still respecting the way the company makes the money in a major way in 2019?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to not putting all your eggs in one basket, right? So it's making sure that we are supporting both the traditional line of business and the new and emerging one, and I think that's possible. But I think what it comes down to for us at Turner Sports is, are we willing to put full live games on social media platforms? Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
That's the line.
Yeah,
Right.
we're not going to give away our IP to these platforms when we pay billions of dollars a year for it. So is there a way that we can create content around it, that we can support it, both as lead-in content, post-game content, second screen experiences, and then how do we monetize the heck out of that so that we make sure that we're actually operating like a P&L. So sometimes you have to get really creative, and sometimes it's really obvious. Sometimes there's social standalone franchises that we can go out and sell. And I think what's really interesting about social monetization is that there's a ton of brands out there that want to be attached to sports but don't have millions and millions of dollars per campaign. So they want an entry point, and social can oftentimes be the perfect way to do that. So, we're kind of the entry point for those brands. And then, but we have told our sales force, and they've abided by it, and it's been a great partnership, is that never give away social media's added value. Like, don't sell a TV and digital package and then throw in social for free, because then you're just diminishing the value of all those eyeballs. That sometimes there's more eyeballs on social than there are on TV. So we do the 360 deals, but we also do discrete social media deals as well.
It's the same advice we give athletes who are curious about how they should be monetizing their brands across social platforms. And I think the presenter before me had sort of had that graphic up about athletes as creators, which is definitely a headwind we're inheriting. But so many deals that have been done in the past are, I did a sneaker deal with sneaker brand XYZ, so I'll just give them 15 social posts that promote the fact that we have an endorsement deal. Those posts have real value because you are literally their spokesperson for that product. And how do you value that in an appropriate way, as opposed to, as Morgan said, just throwing it in as added value, which fortunately we're seeing that turn in our industry.
Rapid fire here towards the end. I'll start with Dave. Just 2 pieces of advice or thoughts you can give the audience to walk away from, or just as they bring back to their teams, or just put your consultant hat on for me for a little bit, how they can apply all this to their brand.
Yeah, I would say, and this is less of advice on the first one, but more of just a thought starter for the group, and that is we are inheriting a headwind of athletes, celebrities, influencers as homegrown on social, and how do we collectively harness that to not only deliver value to those partners, but how do we garner value out of the fact that they are so inherent to these platforms. They know how they work, they know how to engage their audiences. We held an event with 20 of the high school basketball Americans, and I think the average following for this group was like 100,000 followers, and these are 18-year-olds. And so how do we think about that and figure out ways to exchange value with them? That's one. The second, which I had on the tip of my tongue. So we talked a lot about content and we talk about data, and I feel like there's still an opportunity, although it's been discussed a lot, around how do you marry voice with data and create a really compelling content strategy that leverages both, and having that tone that also is backed up and supported, if not optimized, for data. And my analogy, to use a sports analogy, is thinking about how much analytics has started to influence baseball and decisions that managers make in-game and out-of-game around that sport. It's one part science, it's one part art. And I feel like Morgan's team has done an amazing job across all of the brands around using both, and how can we collectively continue to take advantage of the fact that content's being distributed on these platforms. These platforms inherently have a lot more data than other platforms where content lives, and taking advantage of that and using that to your most effect.
My 2 pieces of advice would be, if you're not on a social media team, reach across the aisle, find out how social media teams kind of work and operate and offer your services. Social media teams, by and large, are usually under-resourced and under-budgeted. And so when there are premium content creators like yourselves who are willing to kind of learn that space, figure out how to do something new, I promise you your teams will be receptive to it, as long as it's done in a collaborative fashion. But sometimes social media experts are afraid of showing what they don't know in the traditional space. So sometimes, it's good for those people to reach out. And then if you are, I would say don't limit yourself as a social media expert to only working on social media platforms. What you are is inherently mobile first and fan first. And so there's no reason that just because you've been programming Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat for the last couple of years that you don't know how podcasts can be done differently. It doesn't mean that you don't know how different short-form video franchises or features could be produced. So use your mobile-first and kind of insight-driven or insight-informed way of thinking to help blaze a new trail in the emerging space.
Awesome. Do we have any time for a couple questions, or are we gonna wrap? We're all out. All right, cool.
Cool.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.